Okay, so what you're seeing here is an article, and the title you might see is When Mexico Was Flooded by Immigrants. And it's kind of interesting because today, of course, there's an obsession with people from Mexico and Central and South America coming up across the Rio Grande north into the United States. But the first federal government that had a problem with illegal immigrants coming into Texas was the Mexican government in beginning in the late 1820s, when Americans coming into Texas were basically just ignoring the laws of the Mexican government. And I want to talk about that a little bit. I've talked about the law of April 6th, 1830, which was pretty much ignored by many Americans because, again, Mexico City could pass a law, but it had very, very little enforcement capacity. Mexico City is strapped. Look how big Mexico is. It goes all the way up into California, and from Chiapas to California. There are only 6 million people in the entire country of Mexico, and the majority of those were in central Mexico around Mexico City. So Mexico City could pass laws and could issue decrees, but that doesn't mean that they could enforce these laws or these decrees. And this is what's happening in Texas. And it's one of the problems that's always been an issue with Texas, beginning with LaSalle, that Texas borders a foreign region. First, in the Spanish period, it borders Louisiana, and then more importantly, after 1803, Texas borders the United States. So this is why the Spanish government and the Mexican government's super sensitive to its border, because they know it's a weak area, and it's an area that they don't have much control over. So one of the things that I need to stress is that the anti-slavery feeling in Mexico, and I'm talking about Mexico City now, it culminated in 1829 with President Vicente Guerrero, who, by the way, was of African descent. If he had been in the United States, he'd be considered an African American. He came in, became president of Mexico. It's very chaotic in Mexico. Presidents are coming and going. There's something like 54 governments between 1821 and 1857. It's a chaotic situation in Mexico, which doesn't help when it comes to keeping Texas. But anyway, Vicente Guerrero becomes president of Mexico briefly. And what he decides to do is he issues a decree abolishing slavery in all of Mexico. Now, it's a little bit complicated because this decree was later superseded by other legislation. But you know what? Let's just cut to the chase. And everybody says that slavery was abolished in Mexico in 1829. So let's just agree with everybody. I mean, it's not quite the case, but in effect, slavery was abolished in Mexico, or there was the first attempt to abolish slavery in Mexico in 1829. And that's good enough for me. Our wonderful SI pointed out last semester that actually technically slavery was abolished in Mexico later. And so I'm making a little nod to her because hopefully she's listening to this. I'm sure she is. She's outstanding. But for our purposes, slavery, the Mexican government abolishes slavery in 1829. Okay, note, this is the Mexican central government making this move. It's not Saltillo. So the bigger picture of Mexican politics is this, that now the central government in Mexico City, which supposedly by the Constitution of 1824 is keeping its hands off of what's going on in Texas, is now interposing itself into questions about slavery in Texas. And this is why Anglo-Texans and their Tejano allies become such ardent federalists beginning in 1829, after the law of April 6, 1830 is passed, all the way up into the Texas Revolution. Basically, folks like Austin and other Anglos in Texas, they want Mexico City to keep out of Texas affairs because Mexico City is much more anti-slavery than is Saltillo. There's no voices defending slavery in Mexico City. It's very unpopular. And so what you're starting to have is the Mexican central government is starting to make policy for Texas. And what the Texans are saying, especially Anglo-Texan and their Tejano allies, are saying, wait a minute. The Constitution says that Mexico City can't say anything about slavery, that this is all decided in Saltillo. And the Texans were very happy with that aspect of the Constitution because they had a say in Saltillo. They had some powerful voices that were working with them. So what happens is that word of this, the abolition of slavery, comes into Texas. The governor of Mexican Texas, Salcedo, he hears about it and he immediately suppresses the news because he knows that Anglo-Texans will just absolutely freak out if they hear news about the suspension of slavery, the abolition of slavery in Texas, that many of them will leave Texas. And what I've talked about a lot before, that therefore the cotton industry, cotton production in Texas, the growing of cotton, it was manufactured in the Northeast and in Europe, especially England, that the cotton production, the cotton farming in Texas would end, that Anglos would flee Texas with their slaves, and also Anglos that were in the US thinking about coming into Texas under the new apprenticeship law that I talked about previously, this loophole, that this would kind of blow the whole thing. And so he sends this urgent message to Mexico City saying, look, can you just exempt Texas from this legislation for now? And basically that's what happens for a while. But then comes along the law of April 6th, 1830, which I talked about in the previous podcast, which in effect puts slavery on a very, very quick road to ruin in Texas, a road to abolition. And again, think about the bigger picture here. The law of April 6th, 1830 is the Mexican National Congress making policy for Texas, not Saltillo. And Texans are saying, hey, this is no fair. You're breaking the rules. The Constitution of 1824 said all decisions about slavery in Texas were to be decided by the state Congress. And now the Mexican National Congress is the president abolishes slavery, and then the Mexican National Congress passes the law of April 6, 1830, which basically puts slavery on the road to a very, very quick end in Texas, although Austin was allowed to keep the part of his contract. He's able to bring in some more slaves. But basically, by the middle of 1831, slaves and Anglos are not supposed to come into Texas. The door has been closed. But as this article points out, when Mexico was flooded by immigrants, just because the Mexican government had passed this law doesn't mean that they can enforce it. So there's very little policing on the border between Louisiana and Texas, Arkansas and Texas. Anglos are still coming into Texas. Folks like William Barrett Travis, who of course becomes one of the heroes and the martyrs of the Alamo, he comes into Texas from South Carolina. The story is that he had murdered his wife's lover in South Carolina, and he came into Texas illegally. He ended up staying in Anahuac, which was one of the towns on the Gulf of Mexico where cotton was shipped out of. So you have folks like William Barrett Travis who are coming into Texas, and this new generation of Texans like Travis, they're quite radical. Austin wanted Texas to work within Mexico. Travis doesn't care about that at all. So what's happening is there's a radicalization among Anglos in Texas. There's explicit law breaking among Americans who are coming into Texas illegally, and in some cases bringing their slaves with them. And pretty soon, we're only 6 years away from the Texas Revolution, okay? So we're on the road to the Texas Revolution now. What's happened is the Mexican government has tried to tighten up in Texas, has tried to reinforce its presence in Texas. It's building more forts in Texas. It's sending more troops to Texas. It's trying to tax the cotton that's going out of Texas. It's trying to grab a piece of that pie. And as often happens among a people that have been fairly loosely governed, when the central government tries to tighten up its governing, people don't like it. They don't like paying taxes. They don't like the fact that there's more Mexican soldiers in Texas. They don't like the fact that Anglo-Americans can't come into Texas anymore. They don't like the fact that slavery has been put on the road to abolition in Texas. So what we start to have is this radicalization. But the answer for most Anglos, including Austin, is instead of rebellion, it's like, let's just go back to federalism. Let's let Texas be an independent standalone state that separate from Coahuila, and that Texas will just make its laws based on what's best for Texas, which of course meant the implementation of slavery. So this implementation of slavery, or it's already implemented in Texas, but a continuation and the growth of slavery. So this becomes the huge issue. And this is something you should really write down in your notes because you'll be tested on it. Beginning in the early 1830s, what the Texans want most of all is they want Texas to be a state separate from Coahuila. It's a separate sovereign state within Mexico in which slavery is allowed under the federalism of the Mexican Constitution of 1824. Okay, so Texans start demanding that Mexico City allow Texas to be an independent state, that under the federalism of the Mexican Constitution of 1824, Texas will then allow slavery to exist. But the deal that Mexico gets is that Texas will remain part of Mexico, will become wealthy with the growth of cotton, and that Texas will be a loyal state in Mexico and will be the only slave state in Mexico. But just to jump ahead, the Mexican government, the next Mexican people, they're just not going to buy this deal. Mexican government doesn't want Texas to be a standalone state. They don't trust the Anglos that basically are ruling Texas at this point. And the anti-slavery feeling in Mexico is just too strong.